Welcome in our MOOC course Modern Indian Writing in English Translations. As discussed earlier, Rebati is one of the most important character created by Fakir Mohan Senapati. As we have already discussed about the storyline of the short story Rebati and has also talked about the critical interpretation of the story. In today's lecture, we are going to talk about the themes, symbols, and significance of the story Rebati by Fakir Mohan Senapati. Now, Fakir Mohan Senapati, through his marvelous short story Rebati, has indicated some important factors that we should consider in our modern Indian writings. The first theme that we are going to study is the women education and patriarchal resistance in the story Rebati. The central theme of Rebati is the conflict between a woman who desires to be educated through formal education, and against it is the patriarchal social norms, which acts as a barrier to it. In 19th century rural Odisha, educating girls is seen as a dangerous and heinous crime. Rebati's schooling challenges the so-called beliefs of the society, where it is pertinent and believed that women cannot have right to education. Fakir Mohan Senapati exposes how the patriarchal society fears educated women, associating their learning with the social disorder. The story critiques a society where suppressing the women is the main identity and the main goal achieved by others. Education, instead of being celebrated as a symbol of progress, becomes a source of suspicion and hostility, revealing deep-rooted gender inequality. With this, we move into our second theme as pointed out by Senapati. The second very pertinent theme of the story is superstition versus rational thoughts. The text strongly critiques superstition and blind faith that dominate the village life. When calamity strikes in the form of cholera epidemic, the community irrationally thinks that it is for Rebati's education. Senapati highlights how ignorance works and dominates the scientific temper. Instead of addressing real causes such as poverty, illiteracy, the society seeks supernatural explanation against this epidemic. This theme underscores the destructive power of irrational belief in the common people. Rebati advocates rational thinking and marks a social change. However, superstition becomes the tool of resistance. With this, the village community tries to justify their stand and the desire of a young girl to get educated banished under the so-called superstitions of the society. Another theme that is very poignant in the story is social conformity and collective cruelty. Another important theme is the tyranny of the social conformity. The village operates as a collective, that enforces norms through gossip, judgment, and exclusion. Individuals' suffering is ignored in favor of maintaining the social order, especially against women. Revati becomes a scapegoat when tragedy hits the village. Senapati criticizes this moral standing of the people, showing how collective fear transforms ordinary people into agents of cruelty. The text reveals how marginalized individuals, especially women, are silenced and punished when they challenge the orthodox superstructures of the society. With this, we move into our next theme of the story: innocence, suffering, and the tragic irony. Revati embodies innocence and hope, making her suffering deeply ironic to the readers. Her desire for education is pure and encouraged by her father and progressive men like Basudev. Yet it leads to her social isolation and a great personal loss. The tragic irony lies in the fact that what should empower ultimately brings the tragic fate of Revati. Senapati uses this theme to evoke sympathy and moral outrage, emphasizing that Revati is not guilt but a victim by circumstances that is beyond her control. Her suffering exposes the injustice prevalent in the society and punishes the virtue and ambition, turning into a cause of destruction. Another theme that has been portrayed by Senapati is the call for social reform, not only in the Odia society but also in modern India. Through Revati, Fakir Mohan Senapati presents a strong call for social reformation. The story functions as a critique of conservative attitudes towards women, especially about their education. Senapati urges the readers to question the inherited belief that has been recognized by the society. By portraying the tragic consequence of social rigidity, he advocates compassion, rationality, and progressive thoughts against the societal norms. The theme of reform is implicit, yet very powerful. Revati, as an early realist and feminist text in Indian literature, advocates for women's rights and right to education. It remains very much relevant for its ethical appeal to justice, equality, and social responsibility. With this, we would like to move into the symbols that has been presented by Fakir Mohan Senapati in the story. The very first symbol, which is very important also, is the symbol of education, which marks the progressive idea in a village that is dominated by patriarchy and social norms. In Revati, education functions as the most powerful symbol, representing modernity, enlightenment, and social reform. Revati's schooling signifies that awakening for female consciousness and the possibility of women empowerment in a rigid patriarchal society. However, this symbol of progress is perceived negatively by the entire village community, which associates education with moral decay and social disorder. Senapati uses this contrast to expose the fear of change in the power structure of the society that believes that patriarchy should always get the upper hand in the society and dominate the female education. Progressive thoughts has been misunderstood in the story. Cholera epidemic acts as a very poignant symbol and marks the social ignorance. The cholera outbreak in the society and also in the story symbolizes collective ignorance and superstition rather than a divine wrath. Instead of recognizing the epidemic as a result of poor hygienic and living condition, the villagers blame Rebati's education. Senapati uses the disease symbolically to highlight how irrational beliefs flourish in time of crisis. Cholera thus becomes a metaphor for social decay, revealing how ignorance spreads faster than reason and how society chooses the scapegoat instead of a solution. Another symbol is the village community who acts as a collective operation against the desire of a girl child, Rebati. The village in Rebati symbolizes an oppressive social system that enforces conformity and suppresses individuality. It operates as a moral authority, judging and controlling the position of women. Senapati symbolically critiques how social institutions maintain power by silencing the decent and marginalizing the vulnerable. The community's hostility towards Rebati reflects the danger of unquestioned social reform and also questions the fear that is deeply rooted in the village community, even in modern India. With this, the character of Rebati is also very symbolical, as it marks the innocence and also becomes the victim of the oppression. Rebati herself functions as a symbol of innocence destroyed by the social prejudices. She embodies hope, purity, and aspiration, yet becomes the victim of forces that is beyond her control. Her tragic fate symbolizes the suffering of countless women whose potential is crushed by the patriarchy and superstitious societies. Through Rebati, Senapati universalizes the suffering of a young girl and transforms her personal tragedy into a broader social critique. With this, we would like to discuss Rebati as a story of a marginalized woman. As we all know that one of the most famous critique of marginalization is Gayatri Chakraborty's Spivak. And Spivak, in her writing, Can the Subaltern Speak?, very importantly questions that a woman who is under the colonial rule and also is suffering under the patriarchal norms Can she really speak or not? The story of Revati is also a story of marginalized women. In Revati, Fakir Mohan Senapati presents women's marginalization through the life of a young girl denied agency, security, and voice for herself. Rebati's aspiration for education is treated as a social threat, and it is against the social norms. After the death of her parents, she becomes economically vulnerable and emotionally abused, especially by her grandmother, who blames her education for all misfortunes. Revati is excluded from any decision making, scapegoated by superstition, and left without any social protection. Her suffering reveals how women are pushed to the margins by tradition, poverty, and patriarchal attitude. The story of Revati also advocates the right for women. Advocating women's rights involves recognizing women as equal individuals entitled to education, dignity, freedom, and social justice. Mary Wollstonecraft has spoke about this, with which the feminist movement began. Senapati also has evoked the question of women education and women rights through this story. The story challenges the patriarchal norms that restrict women's choices and silence their voice. Advocacy emphasizes access to education, economic independence, and legal protection. Literature like Revati exposes the consequences of denying these rights to women, and the society needs a social reform. In modern society, advocating women's rights means dismantling the superstition, gender inequality, and structural inequality to ensure the women can live with autonomy, security, and equal opportunity in both public and private spheres. Revati is very significant in our modern day as well. The story of Revati remains important in modern India because it highlights the continuing struggle for women's education, dignity, and agency. Though written in the 19th century, it exposes how superstition, patriarchy, social prejudices can destroy one's life. Even today, many girls face resistance to education. Early marriages and blame during family crisis hits the position of women in the society very hard. Revati urges society to question the regressive tradition and recognize education as a right and not as a threat. The story reminds modern India that social progress depends on equal rights. We should protect the women from marginalization and ensure equal opportunity for learning and self development. Fakir Mohan Senapati's Revati stands as one of the most pioneering work in Indian short fiction. The story is deceptively simple in its narrative structure, but layered with irony, pathos, and social commentary. Senapati moves away from romanticized village depiction and instead presents a lived world shaped by poverty, superstition. The text derives its tragic power from the clash between individual aspiration against the particularly women aspiration against an unforgiving social order that interprets change as transgression. At the center of the story is Rebati, a young girl with innocence and desire for education in her heart. Her wish to study is not portrayed as rebellion but as innocence and curiosity. Encouraged by progressive father and facilitated by Vasudev, the school teacher. However, this aspiration is relentlessly crushed by material deprivation and ideological hostility. Senapati shows how enlightenment and the ideas of enlightenment, when introduced into the feudal and superstitious society with structural support, can paradoxically increase the vulnerability rather than liberation. Education, instead of becoming a tool for empowerment, is transformed into a scapegoat for all misfortunes. From a subaltern studies perspective, Revati powerfully undergrounds the lives of those excluded from the institutional power. Lower level village officials, widows, orphan teacher, and above all is the women. Shambandhu, though relatively comfortable, remains a subordinate cog in the zamindari system, disposed with brutal ease after his death. The zamindar's seizure of land and cattle exposes how colonial feudal power works to marginalize the poor people. Power operates through legality, masked as administration. The subaltern here is not voiceless but unheard. Moral integrity and honesty offer no protection against the systematic exploitation. Senapati anticipates later subaltern historiography by revealing how domination functions through everyday practices rather than overt violence alone. Rebati herself presents the concept of doubly marginalized advocated by Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak. She is poor as well as a female. Her suffering is intensified by patriarchal ideology, embodied most starkly in the form of the grandmother, who internalizes oppressive beliefs and reproduces them through curses and blame. The repeated cry in the story, "You fire that turns all to ashes," becomes a chilling metaphor of how the society demonizes the subaltern women. Senapati does not romanticize this oppression. Instead, he shows how material scarcity, grief, and superstition works against the women, leaving the true source of exploitation unchallenged. Basudev's death further reinforces the tragic determinism in the narrative. As a benevolent figure associated with reform and compassion, his sudden demise suggests the precarity of progressive forces in a hostile environment. Stylistically, Senapati employs irony, understatement, and realistic detail to the devastating effect. The calm, almost detached narration heightens the emotional impact of the final tragedy. Nature imagery, the evening star, the garden, the quiet dusk, contrasts sharply with human cruelty and indifference, reinforcing the sense of cosmic injustice. The ending, where an entire family is erased, is not merely sentimental but political as well, forcing the reader to confront the structural condition that make such annihilation possible. In sum, Revati is a foundational text that anticipates modern critical concerns. It articulates a subaltern consciousness long before the term existed, exposing how caste, class, gender, and the colonial power intersect to silence and destroy vulnerable lives. Senapati's achievement lies in transforming a local tragedy into a universal indictment of social system that punishes hope of a little girl and calls for reform in the society. With this, we end our lecture on the story of Revati and the critical interpretation of the story. Thank you.